and welcome to Tech Talk Today, where we cover the latest in tech in plain English. It is an initiative of AI2.f powered by Druid.ai. Today, we'll cover a fascinating and latest research work which finds that generative language models exhibit social identity biases. Fascinating, isn't it? Let's dive in.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a question that's kind of fascinating and maybe a little bit unsettling. We're going to find out if AI can actually develop in-group bias, just like we humans do, even without being specifically programmed to do it. To help us unpack all of this, we've got some really interesting research from Nature Computational Science, and of course, our amazing expert.
Yeah, it's a really thought-provoking study, and it raises some really important questions about the future of AI and how it interacts with human society.
Okay, so before we jump into the AI stuff, can we maybe just do a quick level set on what in-group bias actually means? I think a lot of people kind of have an intuitive sense of it, but maybe not a super formal definition.
Absolutely. In-group bias basically boils down to favoring your own group over others.
Yeah.
That us versus them mentality, that's unfortunately pretty common throughout human history. And it can kind of manifest in things like in-group solidarity, where you show loyalty and preference for your own group, and sometimes out-group hostility, which can range from kind of mild dislike to more serious prejudice against people outside of your group.
Right, and to be clear, we all experience these biases to some degree, right? It's not always about like overt discrimination. Sometimes it's just like those little unconscious preferences that we have for people who are similar to us.
Exactly. It's part of how our brains make sense of the world by categorizing people and things. But as you said, it can have some negative consequences, especially when those categories become really rigid and lead to unfair treatment.
So this is where the AI research comes in. We know that AI systems learn from the data that we feed them. But what happens when that data reflects our own in-group biases? Could AI start showing favoritism towards certain groups, even if we don't explicitly tell it to?
That's the big question the researchers wanted to answer. And the way they went about testing it is super clever. They took 77 different large language models. Those are the AI systems behind things like ChatGPT. And they basically gave them a kind of personality test.
Wait, so they actually had the AI talk about itself and talk about other AIs? How did they even analyze that?
It's really interesting. So they prompted each AI to complete sentences starting with "we are" and "they are." And then they analyzed the sentiment of the sentences the AI generated. They had a separate AI sentiment analysis tool, actually score the responses as positive, negative, or neutral.
So they used one AI to judge the social biases of another AI. That is pretty meta. What kind of sentences did the AIs come up with?
Some of them were pretty funny, actually. One AI, for example, completed the "they are" prompt with "they're in the business of collecting a fee for doing research for you." Kind of cynical, but maybe not entirely wrong.
Sounds like some of these AIs have a bit of an attitude. What about some of the less funny ones?
Well, some of the "they are" sentences did get pretty negative, which is where it starts to get a bit concerning. What's really interesting is this wasn't just a fluke with a couple of AIs. The results were actually pretty consistent across the board.
So are you saying that the AI was actually showing in-group bias?
Yes, and it was pretty striking. A majority of the AI models showed a clear pattern of favoring their "we" group and expressing more negative sentiment towards the "they" group, even though they weren't explicitly programmed to do so.
Wow, that's actually a bit unsettling. It's almost like they've absorbed our own human prejudices just from the data they were trained on. It makes you wonder what would happen if you trained an AI on even more biased data, like social media.
That's exactly what the researchers did next. And let me tell you, the results were pretty dramatic. They took some of the AIs and fine-tuned them on a data set of extremely partisan political tweets from both Democrats and Republicans.
Oh boy. So they basically gave the AI a crash course in political polarization. I'm guessing that didn't end well?
Yeah, you're right to be concerned. The results are pretty alarming. The AIs became even more polarized in their language. It was like they doubled down on the existing biases.
So instead of becoming more balanced, by being exposed to all these different viewpoints, they actually became more extreme.
Exactly. And this was especially true when it came to negativity towards the out-group. The "they are" sentences generated by these politically trained AIs were particularly harsh and divisive.
Okay, that's starting to sound a bit like a sci-fi dystopia. Is there any way around this? Can we actually make AI less biased?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The researchers did explore that as well. And there is a bit of good news here. When they specifically removed the most biased content, from the AI's training data, the resulting AI was significantly less biased in its outputs.
So it decides possible to create less biased AI, but it takes a deliberate effort to do so. It's not going to happen magically on its own. That puts a huge responsibility on the people and companies who are actually building these systems.
Absolutely. We can't just throw data at an AI and hope for the best. We need to be much more intentional about what we're teaching these systems and how we're evaluating their behavior.
This whole thing just makes me wonder about the real-world consequences of all this. I mean, it's one thing to talk about AI bias in like a research setting, but it's another thing entirely to think about how it might actually impact people's lives in tangible ways.
You're absolutely right. This isn't just a theoretical problem. It's something that could have very real consequences. And it's already starting to play out in different areas of our lives.
Can you give me an example of how this might be happening?
Sure. Think about something like job applications. A lot of companies now use AI to screen resumes and even conduct initial interviews.
Oh, yeah. That's becoming really common these days. What does that have to do with bias?
Well, imagine an AI that's been trained on a data set of resumes that reflects existing biases in a particular industry. Let's say, for example, that there's historically been a huge gender imbalance in tech, with way more men than women in leadership positions.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
If that AI is then tasked with picking out the best candidates, based purely on its training data, it might inadvertently favor resumes that fit the dominant pattern, in this case, male candidates, even if those resumes aren't objectively better than the others.
Whoa. So even if the AI isn't explicitly programmed to discriminate against women, it could still end up doing so because of the biased data it's learned from.
Exactly. And this doesn't just apply to gender. It could happen with any demographic factor that's historically been associated with bias, like race, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, even things like where you went to school or what your hobbies are.
This is making me seriously rethink everything. I thought I knew about objective algorithms. I guess they're only as objective as the data that goes into them.
Right. And human data, as we've established, is full of biases, whether we're aware of them or not. It's a good reminder that we need to be really careful about how we design and use these systems.
It seems like this could have really major implications, not just for individuals applying for jobs, but for entire industries and even society as a whole.
Absolutely. And it's not just job applications either. Think about social media. The algorithms that determine what content we see in our feeds are often powered by AI.
Yeah. And those algorithms have a huge influence on what information we're exposed to, who we connect with, and even how we form our opinions.
Now imagine those algorithms have inadvertently learned to amplify existing social divisions. Maybe they start showing us more content that confirms our pre-existing beliefs, and less content that challenges our viewpoints.
So instead of connecting us with diverse perspectives, social media could become even more of an echo chamber, further reinforcing those biases.
Exactly. And the more time we spend in these echo chambers, the more polarized and divided we become as a society. This could have a huge impact on our ability to have productive conversations and make informed decisions about the world around us.
Okay, this is definitely getting a bit scary. It seems like AI has the potential to really shape our reality and make existing social problems even worse if we're not careful.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? And it doesn't stop at social media. Think about loan applications, healthcare decisions, even criminal justice. These are all areas where AI is being used and where bias could have serious consequences.
So this isn't just some abstract hypothetical problem. It's something that could affect people's access to opportunities, resources, and even justice.
It's a complex issue, and there's no easy solution. But recognizing the problem is the first step. We need to be much more critical about how AI is being developed and deployed, and we need to demand more transparency and accountability from the companies behind these systems.
Okay, I'm getting the sense
that
this is going to require a pretty massive shift in how we approach AI as a society.
I think you're right. We need to move beyond the hype and start asking some tough questions about the potential downsides of AI, and more importantly, what steps we can take to mitigate those risks.
Like, what concrete actions could developers, policymakers, or even everyday users take to address this bias problem? This is where I start to feel a little helpless, to be honest.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed, but there are things we can do. For example, developers can be much more deliberate about the data they use to train AI systems. They can proactively search for and remove biased content, and they can work to ensure that their data sets are representative of the diversity of the real world.
So kind of like an AI detox, cleaning up the data before it's fed to the algorithm.
That's a good analogy. And it's not just about cleaning up the data, it's also about developing new methods to evaluate AI systems for bias and creating tools that can help us detect and correct those biases once they're identified.
That sounds like a huge undertaking.
It is, but it's essential if we want to create AI that's truly fair and equitable for everyone. Policymakers also have a role to play here. They can enact regulations that require companies to address bias in their AI systems, and they can invest in research and development to advance the field of ethical AI.
So this is going to require a multi-pronged approach, with everyone working together to solve the problem.
Absolutely. And it's not just about experts and policymakers. We, as everyday users, also have a responsibility to be aware of these issues and to demand better from the companies whose products we use. We can choose to support companies that are taking steps to address bias, and we can hold those companies accountable when they fall short.
Okay, so it's about being informed, making conscious choices, and using our collective voice to push for change.
That's a great way to sum it up. And remember, the research also showed that AI bias isn't inevitable. When the researchers removed biased content from the trained data, the AI was significantly less biased. That's a powerful reminder that we have agency here. We're not just passive victims of biased algorithms. We can shape the future of AI, and we can work together to create a more just and equitable world.
That's actually really inspiring. It gives me a renewed sense of hope. It's like you said earlier, recognizing the problem is the first step. And now that we're aware of this issue, we can start taking action.
Exactly. We can demand better data, and better algorithms, and better outcomes. And we can do it together.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. I feel like I've learned so much about the potential pitfalls of AI and the importance of being critical and engaged users. I know we've covered a lot of ground here. But before we wrap up, I'd love to get even more practical. What are some specific tips and resources that our listeners can use to navigate this increasingly AI-driven world?
That's a great question, and a perfect way to wrap up our deep dive today.
Welcome back, everyone. We've spent the last 2 parts of this deep dive talking about how AI can pick up biases from the data it's trained on, sometimes in really subtle ways. Now, I know this can all sound a bit overwhelming, but we promise to end on a more empowering note, right?
Absolutely. We've laid out the problem, but the good news is that there are things we can all do to make a difference. Remember, we're not powerless in the face of algorithms.
Okay, so let's talk practical steps. Where do we even begin? What can our listeners actually do about all of this?
Well, one of the most important things is to become more informed consumers of AI. When you're using a product or service that relies on AI, even something as simple as a social media app, take a moment to think about the potential for bias. Is the company transparent about how its AI is trained? Has they talked about steps they're taking to make their algorithms more fair?
So it's about doing your homework and not just blindly trusting that any AI-powered tool is neutral or objective.
Exactly. And if you can't find information about a company's AI practices on their website or in their app, don't hesitate to reach out and ask those questions. The more we demand transparency from the companies building these systems, the more accountable they'll become.
Yeah, this reminds me of something that happened a while back. I was using this facial recognition app just for fun, and it kept misidentifying my friend who's Asian. It was sort of funny at first, but then it really hit me. This isn't just a harmless glitch. This kind of bias, if it's built into facial recognition software that's used by law enforcement, could have really serious consequences.
That's such a great example of how AI bias can show up in unexpected places, and how seemingly harmless tech can actually perpetuate really harmful stereotypes. Speaking up about those biases, even in casual settings like that, can help raise awareness and put pressure on companies to address these issues.
Okay, so we've talked about being informed consumers. What about taking action on a bigger scale? Are there organizations that are working to fight AI bias that we can support?
Absolutely. There are some amazing groups out there that are doing really important work on this issue. Organizations like the Algorithmic Justice League and the Center for Humane Technology are fighting to expose bias, advocate for policy changes, and educate the public about the potential harms of AI. Supporting them, either by donating or volunteering your time, is a great way to amplify your impact.
I love that putting your money or your time where your values are. It's also a great way to connect with other people who care about these issues and feel passionate about making a difference.
That's so true. And don't underestimate the power of just talking about these issues with your friends, family, and colleagues. Sharing articles, podcasts like this one, or just having conversations about the ethical implications of AI can really help raise awareness and get more people thinking critically about the technology they're using every day.
Right, it's like that old saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant. The more we shine a light on these problems, the harder it is for them to hide in the shadows.
I couldn't agree more. And for any listeners who are feeling really inspired to make a difference in this area, one of the best things you can do is actually get involved in the tech world itself.
You mean like learn to code?
Yes. Learn to code, study data science, or even just start learning the basics of how AI works. The more diverse voices we have in the field of AI development, the more likely we are to create systems that are truly fair and representative.
So it's not just about protesting against biased AI. It's about being part of the solution, too.
Exactly. And remember, you don't need to have a PhD in computer science to make a difference in this space. Every voice, every action, every choice we make as consumers and citizens adds up to create a larger shift in how we develop and use AI.
Wow. This whole conversation has really been a roller coaster, from feeling unsettled by the research to feeling totally inspired to take action.
I get it. It's a lot to process.
Yeah.
But I think the main takeaway here is that while AI can pose some real risks, we also have the power to shape the future of this technology and ensure that it's used for good.
I love that message of empowerment. It's not about feeling helpless. It's about recognizing that we have agency even in an increasingly tech-driven world. So to our listeners, keep asking questions, stay informed, and don't be afraid to demand better from the companies and organizations that are building the AI systems that are shaping our lives.
Thanks for having me on for this deep dive. It's been a great conversation.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on another deep dive. We'll be back again next week with a whole new topic to explore. Until then, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep on learning.
Before we say goodbye for now, I hope you had a fascinating learning today with us. Our acknowledgements and thanks are due to Nature Computational Science, publisher of this work, and to the researchers Tian Cheng Hu, Yara Kirishenko, Steve Ratz, Nigel Collier, Sander van der Linden, and John Rosen P. We have also provided the link to the research paper as further readings in the description. Do join us for our next episode, where we again take up really interesting work and unravel it for you. If you enjoyed this, please do encourage us by liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing, and spreading the word around. Thank you so much.